may be a bit melodramatic to suggest that the BRICS dream is falling apart, but look at Russia. It's got isolation policies and the economy in a serious state of bother. Brazil's junk bond status, China's slowed down, and in South Africa, you have the perfect match of a weakening economy headed for junk bond status itself, potentially. This is the Moneymakers. I'm Bruce Whitfield. Tonight, I look at this issue with Professor Matthew Ocran, the chair of the Economics Department at the University of the Western Cape, EMS faculty. He's on the line to us from Cape Town, and on Skype from Shanghai, Leslie Maasdorp, the Vice President of the New Development Bank. Leslie Maasdorp, I'll get to you in just a moment. Matthew Ocran, let's get a perspective from you. Are the BRICS in trouble?
I don't really think so. It's certainly not at a level comparable with the previous performance, but we cannot conclude that the BRICS are falling apart. I think that would not be right at this point in time.
We got the Modi dream wearing a little bit thin in India. The Russian economy is, if not in free fall, certainly in trouble. Brazil's economy ahead of the World Cup and the Olympics next year, that is coming under a lot of strain. The Chinese have devalued their currency. And in South Africa, we've got the issue of twin deficits, falling currencies and potential stagflation. Where do you see a way through this, Matthew?
Well, India's economy is rather performing well. I mean, if you compare that to the rest of the countries that constitute the BRICS as a collective, the performance of the Indian economy is much better. Even though the Chinese economy is softening, it appears to me that the Indian economy will probably be the driver as far as that BRICS team or collective is concerned, because India the forecast is that India will probably be doing more than 7%. Again, when you look at the economy of China, even though we're seeing numbers below 7%, around the midpoints of 6%, the Chinese economy has a huge base, and that's quite phenomenal.
Leslie Maasdorp in Shanghai, thank you for joining us this evening, Vice President of the New Development Bank based in Shanghai. Is Shanghai home to you now, by the way?
That is correct. That is correct, Bruce. I mean, in answer to your question you posed to Matthew, I mean, I'd say that they're obviously short-term, clearly cyclical, and in some cases structural issues with respect to the BRICS economies, which we take note of. But I think it's important from the outset, Bruce, to mention that our point of departure as a development bank, a bank focused on building large-scale infrastructure, that our lenses, the prism through which we look at the world is long-term, right? So we take note of these short-term economic variables in each of the 5 countries, but doesn't really affect, firstly, the New Development Bank and the BRICS formation, because these are institutions that have been set up for the long haul.
Have all the countries paid their initial subscriptions yet to the New Development Bank?
There's a clear sort of timetable, Bruce, for the payment of the capital, and there are no indications that any of the countries will, default on their obligations. So there is no concern at that level. However, there are clearly issues that these countries are dealing with. Emerging markets, though, still remain the engine of world growth. I think if I look at the recent sort of focus on China, and if I just compare the commentary in the sort of traditional media, and I look at living here now, what the sort of domestic media is saying, I think it's almost parallel tracks. You have 2 different messages coming through. I think it's important to know, Bruce, that for the last 2 years, the Chinese authorities have signaled that the economy will slow down, that they're no longer, if you like, in the double-digit growth phase. So growth at these levels, the first 6 months recorded growth of 7% is what was expected. And there is still a slight sort of downward trend for the remaining part of this year forecast. So it's not so much a huge crisis as opposed to concern with respect to the slowing down of the economy.
Let's go back to you then, Matthew Ocran, in Cape Town, because here is Leslie Maasdorp sitting with the benefit of being in location in Shanghai, one of the fastest developing cities on the planet right now. And he's talking about the long-term view for the emerging markets countries. Does the case that was put forward by Jim ONeills as far back as 2001, that these are going to be rapidly evolving and developing economies, does that original hypothesis that caused him to come up with the BRICS acronym still hold true?
It does, because if one looks at the long-term perspective, the long-term prospects, and I think it still holds. And I mean, if one looks at the Indian economy, for instance, and you look at the projections across board, there's a strong belief that the Indian economy is going to do record growth rates 7% plus, for a considerable period of time, given the size and the demographics. Again, in the case of the Chinese economy, it's grown strongly over the recent years. The economy is being rebalanced, but we're still going to be seeing very strong growth from China. I mean, any growth 6% plus is quite commendable as compared to what we can possibly see in the OECD countries and in America. And those numbers are not going to be seen in that part of the world anytime soon.
Leslie Maasdorp, do you see yourselves as the engine room for growth as the new development bank across this region over the next, I don't know, decade, 2 decades? What are your personal time frames when it comes to the role of the new development bank in helping lift this BRICS region and other emerging markets?
Bruce, I think it's important to mention that there are a number of new institutions that have been set up in recent times, specifically here in Asia, which will play a complementary role to the new development bank in sort of giving further impetus to this growth in and investment in infrastructure. So a couple of months before the new development bank was launched, another institution called the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank was launched. There's also a domestic institution called the Silk Road Fund, another $40 billion fund focused on investment in infrastructure. So there are a series of institutions, a lot of them Asia-based, which are also in the infrastructure investment space. Then I think it's important also to mention that there's a new and it's still sort of in the conception stage, but it's called One Belt, One Road. It's a very fancy name for kind of reinvoking the ancient Silk Road, if you like. There's a new long-term project to revive the ancient Silk Road with sort of a modern touch to it. And this is all aimed at an elaborate regional integration strategy, which I think will further fuel growth in China in years to come. But I think, though, just to come back to your earlier question around what is actually behind the slowdown in some of these emerging markets, Bruce, there are clearly some factors which are really outside of the control of some of these countries. The drop in commodity prices, firstly, I mean, that is a global phenomenon impacting very heavily, obviously, on Brazil as a commodities exporter, and then also, obviously, Russia. And in the case of Russia, there's the geopolitical issues in the region. There's a massive exchange rate shock, which they suffered. And then, obviously, the oil price shock has also impacted very heavily on those economies. But I think, there's always silver linings, Bruce. I think it's important to note that, with currencies depreciating, it should sort of feed into the possibilities of these countries rebounding in the form of stronger exports. In the case of Brazil, it's a beautiful country. Having visited them last year during the World Cup, becomes cheaper to visit for Americans and for South Africans and for everyone else. There's always silver linings that one has to look at in the short term. But my overall point, as I mentioned earlier on, is the lenses through which we look at the world is very much longer term.
Absolutely. It's the long-term view. And Matthew Ocran in Cape Town, I mean, part of the long-term view, of course, for many of these BRICS countries is the opportunity presented by the African continent itself under somewhat pressure, economies across the African continent as a result of the softer commodity prices that Leslie Maasdorp talks about. But sometimes you have to have the courage to look lift your head up and look 5 years from now rather than trying to think how we're going to survive the next 6 months.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, in each of these, in the case of South Africa, we do have a bit of a medium-term plan, but I see every day through my interaction here with both the Shanghai provincial, or rather the Shanghai, the city government, as well as the central government, the value of really having such a long-term vision. Right now, we do have the National Development Plan in South Africa. I just think that the reinvoking the idea of long-term economic planning is so important when countries are going through sort of cyclical challenges like Brazil and Russia are currently, because there's no magical sort of formula you can follow as a government policymaker. The finance minister of Brazil, Joachim Levy, is a very celebrated and well-known economist and very famous in financial markets and so on. But there's no musician who can sort of solve those problems overnight. I mean, in the case of Brazil, as you might know, the country is very dependent, for example, on hydropower. They're experiencing a severe drought at the moment. So things just compound, when you have bad news, things just tend to sort of get worse, right? But they will come out of it. They're the 7th largest economy in the world, the 8th largest in terms of consumption in the world. And, the oil price at some stage should rebound. So the ingredients of further growth, we believe, are there. And we believe that with proper responsible fiscal and macroeconomic management, they should be able to emerge from the crisis intact.
Professor Matthew Ocran in Cape Town, thank you. Leslie Maasdorp, final question to you this evening. It was Keynes, I think, who said in the long term we're all dead. In the short term, what sort of sense of optimism can you bring us from Shanghai?
Well, firstly, China as the second biggest economy, and soon over time to become the biggest economy of the world, is still fundamentally the growth engine, right? It contributed just more than 30% of global growth this year, despite the sort of recent announcement around the slowdown. And then secondly, as I said, there are hundreds of billions of dollars of new capital devoted for infrastructure investment. The New Development Bank is only one. There's another $100 billion in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, Silk Road Fund, and so on. I think with all of these vehicles that are focused on building the infrastructure to propel future growth, I think therein lies the possibilities of seeing the economies lifting up again. But right now, the general mood globally is pretty negative.
Leslie Maasdorp, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us from Shanghai this evening. Also to Professor Matthew Ocran, the Chair of Economics at the University of the Western Cape's EMS faculty. He's on the line to us from Cape Town, and on Skype from Shanghai, Leslie Maasdorp, Vice President of the New Development Bank. Good to have you both on. Thank you for watching. Until tomorrow night, thank you for watching too. Good night.